Good mic. Okay, the mic. Could we actually stop the music and start the show? No. I'm sure more people will be coming in, but we hit the time and we have a fairly full agenda. So this is the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, chartered by the IETF, to research how protocols strengthen and/or threaten human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Okay, so the agenda, and this is the agenda bash, is welcome and introduction. Then is a talk by Art, Thai Citizen Network. Then there's a talk by Ashwin. I don't have the titles of those. Do you have?
So Art's talking about freedom of association online, and Ashwin's talking about trust in protocols.
Thank you. I knew I'd get you to talk. Then there's an update from the hackathon, an update from the Human Rights Review team, research group drafts. There's 3 of them that we'll go going through. Then there's update and discussions on drafts yet to be adopted by the research group. And that's got 5 minutes. There's 1 draft in that one at the moment, I believe. Then there's an open discussion, which is focused on sort of what is our next task, where are we going, and some of the questions that have come up over the months about what is this group doing and where is it going. And then any other business if we still have time for it. Are there any issues with this agenda? Any additions, changes, things that are wrong? No? Good, then I guess we'll go with that one. Okay, the note well is here. This is probably the first meeting of the week with the note well, and you'll see it often. This is the IETF note well, but it applies to the IRTF as well. And what's really important are all the definitive information in the documents that are listed in that list. I will not read them. Okay, so the objectives. To expose the relation between protocols and human rights with a focus on the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. But you'll notice that we do go broader, and that was partly because people said, how can you talk about the one without talking about more? to propose guidelines to protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment in future protocol development in a manner similar to the work done for the privacy considerations in RFC 6973. And we've sort of been following that lead insofar as we could, to increase the awareness in both human rights community and the technical community on the importance of technical workings of the internet and its impact on human rights. Our outputs, internet drafts, policy and academic papers, of which we have done very few, and one of the things that I want to talk about at the end is how do we get more involved in that. Film and textual interviews. There was the film that was produced at the beginning of this, which is still available on the website. Data analysis and visualization, and protocol analysis of existing protocols. So we have a fairly wide scope of work that we can do, some of which we're paying more attention to than the others at the moment. The work to date, October 14 through 15, research and research group proposal. In 15, there was the screening of the film Net of Rights at IETF 94. December 2015, we were chartered. 2017, 8280, research into human rights protocol considerations came out. Current work, we have internet drafts that are research group drafts. There's freedom of association on the internet. There's guidelines for human rights protocol considerations. There's notes on networking standards and politics. And there's an expired anonymity, human rights, and internet protocols. And there's the work of the Human Rights Review Team. And that's it for this one. So that brings us to our first speaker, correct? And our first speaker is Art and Freedom of Assembly and Association Online. Art, you've got a microphone up there. You've got a clicker. Place to put your stuff down. Make yourself at home. And I will start passing out the sheets now that I've done the original talking and the room is full. Well, fuller. Thank you. Go ahead.
This one, right?
Yeah, this microphone's yours. Oh, wait a second before you start. I forgot. I need a scribe and I need a jabber scribe, and I forgot to do those. Are there any volunteers for either of those two roles? I see people staring at each other, but I don't see anybody volunteering yet. Okay, so the jabber scribe, and was your hand up for the note taker? Thank you. Okay, please. Sorry to start you and then interrupt you.
Hi everybody. This is my IETF meeting. So anyway, welcome to Bangkok. Well, this is my hometown. So that's the only thing I'm very confident about at the moment. Anyway, let's see how it goes, right? Trying to, I'm not a network engineer, right? Although I'm graduated in like computer science, AI, whatever, but network engineering, it's not my turf, right? I'm completely have no clue. So like, let's have some discussion after this, right? But this is the thing that I'm doing at the moment. I work for an NGO based in Bangkok, working on digital rights, right? Specifically more on the data protection, privacy online, and also freedom of expression, right? So and actually like a lot of materials here actually like borrow from like different people, like Article 19 included, APC, whatever, right? But let's see, right, how we can link this like together. So maybe first thing first, right? So we're going to talking about like two kind of rights, right? Two kind of freedom here, right? The first one is about the assembly, right? the rights to like be able to just like gather together, like demonstration, like walking on the street, public spaces, things like that, right? So that's one thing, the assembly one, right? Another one is association, right? For example, like forming a political party, forming a trade union, labor union, or inside your workplace, right? Or there's different kind of like probably like national or local, regional context as well, right? So that's two things, like assembly and association, right? In the context of the international treaties, like a lot of times when we're talking about freedom of assembly, oftentimes we will use this actually example, like freedom of peaceful assembly, right? So what is actually peaceful, like there's many interpretations, right? I will show you later, like in the next slide, right? But basically, right, when we're talking about like the freedom of assembly and association, right, we're talking about it happens in a space, right, wherever the space is. So the same thinking, like should be like also like extended to the online spaces as well. If you ask me, I will answer like yes, right? If you ask other people, I'm not sure. Well, but that's the kind of baseline here, right? That at least for a lot of groups, right, we think that like, okay, any human rights that we enjoy offline should also like the same extended to online as well, right? So when we talk about peaceful, right, what's actually like peaceful, right? There's one interpretation, let's say, like or suggestion, like in the guidelines from the organization. There's a lot of acronyms here, right? But I mean, like this is IETF anyway, right? So acronyms, right? So this is from Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, right? So they say like it should like also include, right? I mean the peaceful assemblies, right? Also include the conduct that may annoy, well, or give offense, right? And even conduct that temporarily hinder, impedes, or obstructs the activities of third parties, right? The one that probably like not like involved, right? In the demonstration, or like probably not a stakeholders in the demonstration, like third parties, but even like someone get offended or maybe annoyed because of the fact that like someone is actually there's a lot of people in front of like some buildings or on the street, or they cannot go somewhere in the city easily on that day, but that's still like peaceful anyway, right? How we can going to actually like interpret it like in the online context as well, right? Should like, I don't know, like if I actually if I'm an organizer of say an online campaign, if I ask like people who may be like not really happy with some bills, right, for example, right, to visit a government website, right, a lot of people, right, at the same time, to the point that probably the regular visitor of that services cannot really use the service, or the service like are going to be very slow. Will that be still like a peaceful assembly online or not, right? I don't know. Anyway, right, so we're talking like peaceful, right? We're talking like the spaces, we're talking about activities, right? But as in any kind of like international treaties, like or convention, there are always like limitations. So this one is from ICCPR, right? International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right? So in Article 21st and 22nd, they say like, okay, there should there can be, right? There can be some limitations, right? But those limitations should be provided by the law, right? And those, I mean, there should be some, how to say, like the really legitimate reasons, right? Like for example, like this is like very common, right? National security, public order. And the last thing is like the protection of author rights, which is like, this is actually open to a lot of interpretation. In some countries, these author rights will also include like, well, copyright infringement or like pornography as well, right? Which like to other people interpretation, this kind of debatable, right? Whether like the pornography or copyright infringement should be also included here or not, like to prevent someone to enjoy their freedom of assembly or association. Two dimension, right, of assembly, right? We're talking like people like gathering on the street, right? Demonstration online or offline, right? But before they can actually do that, like there should be some plan, organization of that first, right? So when we talk about freedom of assembly, we at least, right, talking about these two dimensions, right? The first one is like actually before the assembly could actually take place, right? There should be some communication planning, right? Organizing something, okay, we're going to meet here and there at this place, or how many people, or how many like toilets we actually need, do people actually have some like special needs or not, right? So actually there are some organizations, right, before the assembly can actually take places, right? So that's the first thing, like people should have the right to actually organize and plan an assembly. Right, and the second dimension is like the assembly itself, right? And this should apply whether it's like online or offline. Like some of the assembly, right, can actually organize online, and then the assembly itself actually happens offline. Or I can go vice versa as well. I can actually meet someone here, right, offline, and talking about, well, probably next week we should like gather together, maybe on the Twitter, and try to use the same hashtag like for the whole week, right? So we actually plan it offline for the action that's going to happen online, right? So actually, like, there's no clear border here, right? The same freedom and rights here is actually like you can like skip jumping from one space to other space. But yes, basically there's two dimensions, right? To plan and then to take the action from that planning. And here's like, so previously I'm talking about the freedom of assembly, right? And this one is for the association. There is two things that we can thinking about like here, right? It's like we're talking about like the associations, like or category of associations that already existing, right? Or offline, right? And because there's an online communication, electronic communication, right? It can help further, right, this association to reach out like more members or have like more activities, like or make it like more like, effectively, basically, right? But there's also a second kind of thing here as well. Is like there are some kinds of association that in some societies, right, in some society, it may only exist online because in the offline spaces, it's probably just too dangerous, right, for them to actually like, have it, right? For example, some political ideologies or belief, like religious belief in some countries, probably just too dangerous, like to have some association offline or like LGBT group, something like that, right? So this is why, right, a lot of people think that, well, actually, this is like actually very crucial, very important, or why we should also have the freedom of association in the online spaces as well. We're talking about two rights of freedom so far, right? Freedom of assembly and also freedom of association. How this actually links, right, to all the rights, right? Before this, right? In the opening, we're talking about the RFC. They're talking about the privacy considerations, right, in the design of the internet protocol, right? So how that's actually going to help, right, the freedom of association or assembly, right? So let's see like how it links together, right? I'm actually like, I mean, Tiny Design Network, right? The group that I'm working for, right? Actually, we started first to fight basically against the censorship, like online censorship, right? So that's the freedom of expression, right? That's the first thing that we're working for like, I don't know, like 9 years, something like that. But so maybe this is like one of the first thing that people can think about that, like, yeah, well, I mean, to be able, right? I mean, when we're talking about freedom of assembly and association, it is because something we have something to say, basically, like whether it's going to be on the street, like we held a demonstration, right? Enjoy the freedom of assembly because we want to express something, like and let the public knows about that, right? Or we can express that like in the form of association, right? We form a group, right? And then we submit letters or recommendation, whatever, like through some like a little bit more formal mechanism, right? But this is basically to enjoy also like our freedom of expression. So that's kind of like the first linkage they've been thinking about, like how freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and association can be like linked together. But before we can actually have some messages to actually to express, to say something out loud, out there, right? Maybe we have to actually a little bit like take a step back and think it through, right? Discuss with our friends, colleagues, right? Why we're going to say something like that? What is the goal of saying so? Or like what's our aim of the demonstration, for example, right? So before the expression, sometimes, right, it actually needs require as well, right, the freedom of association. So we can actually formulate, like the expression inside that. And maybe the last one here is like about the right to privacy, right? It's kind of like because like I will talk about this like also as well in the next slide. I think like so basically it's like to realize right these two freedom, right, assembly and association, right, or some anonymity, right, or privacy, right, is a key as well. Why, right? I mean, like basically, like we're talking like online spaces, right? The freedom to actually the rights to actually organize and plan something, right? And actually in the end, like, actually taking place in some spaces, right? When you plan something, right, it needs a secure communication channel, right? And when you're going to make the assembly, the demonstration to taking place, it needs some spaces, right? I mean, I cannot actually do a demonstration, right, without space to stand on, right? I mean, I have a physical self, for example, right? So there's some if that's the demonstration in the physical space, right? That there should be a physical space to demonstrate anyway. And this is also apply right on in the online spaces as well, right? So basically, we need like to enjoy freedom assembly, right? We need secure communication, we need safe and publicly accessible space, right? And this doesn't necessarily to be publicly owned space, right? For example, in the case of the physical occurs, right, demonstration back then, when if you still remember that Occupy Wall Street, is actually taking place in the privately owned public spaces, right? So when we're talking like a publicly accessible space, it doesn't necessarily to be publicly owned spaces. It can be like privately owned as well, right? But basically, the public should be able to get access to it, right, freely. And also to enjoy freedom of association, right? I think, well, to form something, right, you need someone who actually like mind. You can actually like kind of lean yourself like on them, like sometimes as well, like you need trust, right? And sometimes, right, in the situations, it's actually maybe like sensitive, right? As mentioned earlier, right, in some countries, some political ideologies or religious belief can be very dangerous, right? So maybe you need a relative anonymity as well, right, to be able to form some clubs or associations, right, for that sensitive matters or belief, right? So here come the technical measures that can actually go against all this, right? So when we're talking about like freedom assembly, right, governments actually, or sometimes also like corporate as well, that has enough power, do this stuff, right? Filtering, blocking, this is kind of common practices, right? But also like the distributed denial of service attack as well, right? To bring some website down. There's a cases, for example, here in this region, right? I think like around 3-4 years ago, during the demonstration in Malaysia, right? Anti-corruption demonstration, Bersih 2.0, right? Some of the news websites that try to actually distributed news about the demonstration, and also like some certain smaller websites that helping organizing the demonstration got actually DDoSed by basically unknown attackers, right? But basically it bring the side down, right? So what happens is actually like with this like filtering, monitoring, blocking, DDoS, right? It affects the integrity of communication and availability of the spaces, right? So in turn, like it limits freedom assembly. Same things like go as well, right? I mean, actually related kind of like technical measures like surveillance and profiling, right? Also affects confidentiality, right? Which limits privacy, creates some fear, right? So, among people, whether I'm not really sure whether I can actually trust you or not. You're actually the one that actually claim that you are, or whether like the information's like out there is actually can be trusted or not, things like that. So this can affects, right, the freedom of association as well. So these are technical measures that are already taking place, right, or at least like I think in the past 5 years are very well documented, right? And there are some cases that actually submitted to the UN Special Rapporteur for the freedom of assembly and association. Apart from the documentation on the offline assembly and association, right? In the recent years, actually more submission on the violations of these kind of things online as well. right? And here's come like how I don't know like this community, right, and others like trying to I think like before this we already mentioned this, right? But there are also other like attempts as well, right? From this community, right? So apart from the privacy consideration, right, this is also the development further on that line. So I mean, monitoring, right, is actually the thing that, as a network engineer, to my understanding, like people actually have to do like on a normal basis anyway, right, to do evaluation, to test, to actually improve the status, right, and availability and the quality of service, right, of the network, right. But pervasive monitoring is different, right. So these are RFC like 7258, right? What they're trying to do is like, this is from the abstract, right? It's like, you say like pervasive monitoring is a technical attack that should be mitigated in the design of IETF protocols where possible, right? So I think if you have interest in this, right, you can take a look on this, right? But basically this one related to like getting back to that, the freedom of association, right? When we're talking about I say like previously that the surveillance, right, or profiling, right, will create atmosphere of fear, right, and it can limit the freedom, like the people, how do people enjoy the freedom of association. This pervasive monitoring is basically the surveillance, right, or including profiling as well, right. And here goes like other RFC. So I think I just like give you some idea, right, or how or what other things go, I mean, on the ground at the moment, right, in terms of like freedom of assembly and associations, give you like some societal like context, right, and maybe we can have enjoy a discussion after this, right, after the second speaker, and you see how like those like works by ETF, IRTF, right, can come to this. So this one is try to do that. So previously we're talking about the privacy, right, surveillance, right. This one talk more specifically about intent filtering, right, in different contexts, right, or about like over-the-top content provider, CDN, things like that, right. Which like at different levels, at different players, probably they have different data that they actually handle, or different power, right, that can actually do. So that's all for me at the moment, and getting back to this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We have time for questions or comments at the mic. Would anybody like to? Please remember to give your name. Thanks.
Jonathan Hoyland, Royal Holloway. So I've been reading quite a lot of research about this at the moment, and apparently a more common technique than fear would be what's termed flooding, and so providing lots of alternative content to prevent people being able to find the appropriate content. And I feel like you need some extra right in your list, because you could respect all of the rights you listed and still prevent true freedom of association, or being unable to arrange a protest because no one can find out about it because there's so much spurious content.
Sure, like flooding. Yeah, that's a thing that very common practices. Yeah.
But would you say that there's some alternative right that you need to have, or is that just something you have to accept that governments or whomever are allowed to do?
I think that one will go to the maybe platform provider level, right? And I think in the end, I'm not sure, right? Because in the end, I think the packages you're talking about is more like the content flooding, right? So probably it's like go above this level of network. So I'm not sure, but I mean like okay, this is like another discussion, right? I used to have a communication with people from YouTube, things like that, right? They say like they see this is actually like a problem, not necessarily because of they actually like honor human rights, whatever, right? I mean they actually do, but like they have actually more interest of that, like because of that it will degrade the quality of service of their own platform, right? People will think, oh, it's like the same repetitive contents again, so it's boring, things like that, right? So they're trying to like find some way to actually solve the issue as well. But probably it's like at a different level. Yeah.
But it's probably something the in the HRPC might do research in.
Maybe I'm not, yeah, sure. That's the thing. Thanks a lot. Well, in addition to this, I think like it's very interesting that like a year ago we're not sure whether they actually intentionally do this or not. Like we found this at least in Thailand, in few other countries, when there is a demonstration, the policemen actually not really sure whether intentionally or not. Okay, let's say, but they do this. Like they did this. They actually open the music very out loud, right? And this music is actually copyrighted. So people try to actually do live on their Facebook or YouTube or whatever, right? So the police actually like open this copyrighted music out loud, right? And the algorithm inside Facebook and YouTube detect it and bring the clips, the live down. We don't have an evidence whether they actually intentionally do this or not, but that's more and more like be found, right? Lately, very interesting. Okay, thanks.
Ted Lemon. Yeah, so just to sort of follow up on what the gentleman just said, this is actually a theme that I've been noticing as I've been reading the current documents, that they seem to really be talking about the world as if it were, I don't know, 1970. And they're not really talking about all of the various ways that you can attack and suppress human rights using the internet that are not possible elsewhere. And so it's more, so in other words, the focus right now seems to be more on preserving existing rights on the internet as opposed to identifying attack surfaces and talking about how to address the attacks that can be done. And this is very concerning to me because you know, if you look at what's actually going on the internet as opposed to, you know, what's being written in the drafts, most of the issues that we're having are more along the lines of what we were just talking about, like the attack that you just described, which I think we can very clearly say is an attack, whether it's intentional or not. It's brilliant, right? You're using the content filtering of an online provider against the protesters, right? It's brilliant. And there are many attacks like this, and if we don't enumerate, if we don't talk about these attacks, if we're not researching these kinds of attacks, then I don't think there's a whole lot of point in the rest of what we're doing, because I think that these are where the problem lies. The problem doesn't lie in, I mean, yes, of course, you know, we can put up firewalls, you know, like the Great Firewall of China is an example of censorship, right? But these are relatively trivial in comparison to some of the other attacks that we've seen. And I think that if we're not seriously talking about those other attacks, then we're really not going to accomplish a whole lot.
Thanks a lot for contribution. Yep.
Just a quick comment on that one. That seems to also, though, be one of the problems that we're getting into on the list sometimes is where are we talking about how some application is used versus where are we talking about what a protocol enables or disallows. And sort of cutting that line there has been sort of a difficulty, but thanks. Please.
Well, Nalini Elkins. I really want to agree a lot with what Ted is saying. One of the real problems I think we have is, you know, there's so many new things that are possible and so many new things that are going to happen with the capabilities that we have, that I think we really need to be thinking and talking about what's going to hit us in the future, not just what has happened in the past.
Thanks.
Ted Lemon again. So I think we're possibly using this as an excuse to have a discussion that's not quite on the topic of the talk that we just heard, so I apologize for that. But to just speak to Avri's point, the problem that we have is, the difference between an application and a protocol is relevant here, but I think that we can learn a lot by looking at the applications, even if we're not, you know, of course, if we're writing protocol considerations, then we can't tell you how to write your application, but we can think about how the protocol implicated, or how the functioning of the application was affected by the protocol that was running. We can learn a lot from these protocols. So for example, if you look at SMTP, if you look at the things that are implemented on top of SMTP, there are some pretty clear abuses that we've seen that actually are part of the protocol. Like they're second order effects of the way that the protocol is structured. if the protocol had been structured quite differently, many of the negative behaviors that we see occurring as a result of applications of SMTP wouldn't even be possible. So it's something to think about. The theme that I've been seeing as I've been reading these documents is that they really don't seem to be rooted in problems. It's not that they're not talking about real problems, but they're not rooted in specific problems. And the problem is if they're not rooted in specific problems, then you're basically just building cloud castles. And so if we can actually look at specific problems and see how those specific problems, how those were made possible by the way we designed the network and by the way we designed our protocols, then we can come up with a taxonomy that's rooted in actual experience rather than one that's rooted in, papers that people, somebody was referencing Heidegger in one of the documents, which actually was very topical. I mean, it was actually a really good reference, but we need stuff that's about what we're doing now, not about dams on rivers.
Thanks. It sounds like a good draft. And I'll cut the line after Neil's so that we can get to the next presentations. And we'll come back to this discussion, I think,
Again, sure.
towards the end as we talk. I was going to cut it after you.
You can.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
Please.
Brett Jordan, just a quick comment on the attack surface, the things to think about. I think we in the IETF have done a great job recently or over the past 5-10 years of starting to make it so passive surveillance is not possible and to protect people's sessions and integrity of their sessions. But one of the concerns I have is, are we basically guaranteeing that people will be able to be identified, because their session is completely, non-modified between 2 points? So are you basically guaranteeing that people can be traced? If you go and you attack the service provider, and now you have guaranteed knowledge that the person on the other end is who that person is. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
Okay. But
Finish-
this is
finish up with a comment,
just to finish this. I think it's that I see a good side. Let's say, right. That's a lot of improvement so far, right. At least like from the outsider perspective, would say. But I think one of the problem here, which a lot of people here already realizes, like there's a lot of technical assumption, also like societal assumption, right, that we use, right, to design these protocols, right, and probably those assumptions is like from 20 or 40 years ago, and then it's no longer hold true, right. So I think that's the way forward. That like, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, the next one is, so thanks a lot. The next one is Ashwin Jacob Matthew, UC Berkeley, speaking about, and he's remote. So do we have Ashwin?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. And yeah, thank you to Niels and Mallory for the invitation to speak. I'm very happy to be with all of you. I'm sorry you can't be there in person. And Mallory, will you be running my slides for me?
Yes.
Okay.
And you're there.
So yes, there we go. So I'll be perhaps in many ways like picking up on some of the questions that came up in the discussion at the end of that last really interesting talk, and talking about the role of trust in protocol design. So really not so much about human rights per se, although I will try and make those connections. I used to be a technologist, then I went to school and became a social scientist. So now I pretend at being both. I'm currently with the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley, where my current work is looking at the role of trust in cooperation, learning, and information security. I'm also attached to Packet Clearinghouse, which some of you may know. But what I'll be talking about today is some of my earlier work looking at one internet protocol in particular, the Border Gateway Protocol, and looking at the role of trust in the Border Gateway Protocol. And what I'll do in my talk today is walk you through some of that research and try and generalize it in a way that I hope will be more broadly applicable for thinking about the role of trust in protocol design. Next slide, please. Can we get to the next slide, Maury? There we go. So the way that we often think about human rights are very much in the one just before that.
Sorry, I think there's a delay, so I will change when you ask me to, but it might take a bit for it to appear. Yeah.
But the way we often think about rights is the top half of that picture as the social realm, right? As things that are enacted in laws and so on, and issues that you're all very familiar with. And the challenge that I think that all of us face that is very much the subject that all of you are dealing with is how we connect the infrastructures of the world, the internet in particular, to questions of the social, to questions of rights. And it's going from, as earlier speakers at the mic were talking about, the concrete threats in the world and how do you actually connect them to particular articulations of protocol standards. Now, it's a relationship that's long been discussed in some of the social science literature on infrastructure. And I'll reference some of that as I go along. Next slide, please. So my story starts here with the Border Gateway Protocol, and one of the more visible route hijacks in the protocol, of which there are many, but this was one that got a lot of attention at the time, which was when Pakistan briefly hijacked YouTube. And this was because, connecting to a rights issue, where the government of Pakistan issued an order to the Pakistan Internet Exchange and to networks within Pakistan to block a particular video on YouTube, claiming it was blasphemous. But equally, in the news at the time and local coverage, claims were equally made that the order came out because there were videos showing problems of vote rigging and electoral fraud cover-ups on YouTube, which is why the government was doing this. Now, the way that the Pakistan Internet Exchange chose to implement the block, as some of you may know, was to announce that they knew a better route to YouTube than Google. Intended to do it only within Pakistan, but through misconfiguration, that announcement spread to their upstream networks and to the rest of the internet. And so for about 2.5 hours back in 2008, the internet thought that YouTube was in Pakistan. And this very much set me on my path in my research, which was to ask the question, well, if Pakistan can hijack YouTube, so trivially, why is it that the internet is stable at all? Why is it that the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, is stable? And it's an interesting moment to look at this because in many ways, again, as some of the speakers at the mic earlier were pointing out, we understand infrastructures, we understand rights at moments of breakdown. And at this moment of breakdown, connected to a moment of a breakdown of rights, as much as a breakdown of the infrastructure, we can start to connect some of the technical affordances in BGP with some of the expressions of control being over it in the way that the Pakistan Internet Exchange chose to do this. Next slide, please. Just a very quick overview and a reminder of how BGP works. If I was sitting at home at my provider, sonic.net, and I wanted to get to the UC Berkeley website, I would go through the network's N layer, then transit trail, then scenic, and then get to UC Berkeley. But the way that my provider gets to know about this route to UC Berkeley is that UC Berkeley is announcing its IP addresses using BGP to scenic, which relays them to transit trail, relays them to N layer, and so on to sonic. And so the routing table of the internet gets built in this distributed fashion. Now, what's interesting about BGP as it stands today is that there are all these kinds of claims. There are routing claims about where you can get. There are identity claims about who you are and who you can get to. There are resource claims about what IP addresses you carry. But what's really interesting about it as a protocol is that there are no warrants for any of these claims. And that, in many ways, is why Pakistan was able to hijack YouTube in the first place and why prefix hijacks, route leaks have been issues throughout the history of BGP. Next slide, please. So now, what does this mean for us when we think about rights? And let me broaden out the conversation for a minute before I narrow back down on BGP again. Now, one way that we think about rights is in a balance between autonomy and accountability. Right? You have the guarantee of a freedom of speech, but equally you're held accountable. You can't engage in hate speech, for instance. You can't engage in defamation. And that balance is in many ways one way in which rights are articulated. And again, the balance is found differently in different places under different political conditions. Now, how might we start to think about that balance in terms of protocols? Right? This is very much a balance that goes back to the early days of the internet when John Perry Barlow was telling us, but declaring the independence of cyberspace, right? That this is a space beyond control. But instead, I suggest that what we might start to ask of our protocols, instead of looking at particular rights, the way that we might get to thinking about how a balance between autonomy and accountability is manifested within infrastructure might be to ask these questions. Who can exert control? Who is able to exert control to ensure autonomy or to ensure accountability? And equally, how can we trust? How can we trust these systems? How does trust function within the context of these systems? And analytically, I'll break these down in the course of my talk over three areas, right? The standards. What is the actual form of the standard? What does the standard allow? The gentleman earlier was talking about SNTP, that there are particular features of SNTP that allowed particular kinds of abuses. Equally for BGP, there are particular features of BGP that allow route hijacks, for instance. And equally, who makes the standards? All of you at the IETF, how do standards organizations function? The next piece is resources. What resources does a protocol need in order to operate, and who controls those resources? How are they to be trusted? The regional internet registries in this instance. And finally, what is the topology upon which a protocol operates? And how is that topology managed? In this case, how did that route leak happen? How is it that the Pakistan Internet Exchange was able to hijack and reconstruct that topology? Next slide, please.
You lost the full screen.
There we go. And so let's talk about how authority shifts, like over the history of the protocols that came to be BGP. And back in the days of the ARPANET, you go back to RFC 823, you have the gateway-to-gateway protocol. The original protocol for interconnecting networks, for interconnecting the different gateways of the time. In that protocol, it actually defines authority. It says, all the gateways are under a single authority and control, as is the practice in other network implementations. There was no notion that the internet was to be decentralized. There was a very clear definition of where authority and control was meant to reside. You move forward to the next generation of the protocol, the exterior gateway protocol, which was deployed in the NSFNet. And you see, again, not a defined definition of authority, but a definition of topology. It's intended for a set of autonomous systems connected in a tree with no cycles, and therefore the NSFNet backbone becomes the authority, the default authority. They ran the policy routing database where all the routes were maintained, and it was from the backbone that routing was controlled. But then you get to the internet with BGP. BGP originally deployed in the NSFNet, but then was used to make the public internet. And you get to a point where all of a sudden there is no hierarchical network. You have a complex graph that we have today. And in making the transition from the NSFNet to the internet, the NSF issued a solicitation for a resource arbiter, which has become the RADB today, and the system of internet route registries that in theory would act to establish and maintain databases for routing services which may be used by attached networks to obtain routing information, but need not be used. And as many of you may know, these are in fact not used by all networks. Some use them, some don't. They're used to different degrees. So the question then becomes, as following the YouTube example, how is authority maintained within the context of this decentralized system? Right? And just to remind us about how complex the system really is, next slide, please. We're currently looking at over 60,000 individual networks, 60,000 autonomous systems, announcing over 740,000 IP address prefixes. And as I found in my research, the key mechanism for stabilizing these interconnections is really trust and interpersonal trust. Now, what do I mean by trust? And I will tell you when we get to the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, there are many definitions of trust, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a relational definition. That in general, when you have a problem of engaging with someone else in an interaction that involves some risk and uncertainty, how do you solve that problem? Now, one solution is to have an assurance structure, as might be called in the literature, which is, well, I'm exchanging paper money with someone. Do they need to trust me to accept that the money has value? No, you trust your central bank because you have something else. You have an assurance structure, the bank that is assuring the value of the money. Equally, you might say, well, I've interacted with this person for a while. I actually don't have to rely on a third party to provide assurances. I can trust them as an individual. So for instance, you go to the corner store and they've seen you like shopping there for a while and one day you forget your wallet. And perhaps the shop owner says, well, I trust you. I've known you for a while. Pay me when you come the next time. And so it's not to say that these are the only two solutions to the problem of risk and uncertainty, and not that they're mutually exclusive, but analytically it's useful to pull them apart, to think about assurances versus interpersonal trust as solutions to the problems of risk and uncertainty. Next slide, please. And of course, these aren't merely interpersonal problems, these are societal problems. Right? And so we can talk about system trust, the large systems that we trust in, like the internet, and the assurance structures that provide anchors for those systems. We can equally talk about interpersonal trust, the networks of relationships, the reputation we form within those networks that allow those systems to function. And equally talk about generalized trust. We say, oh, we're all part of the same community. We've all come to the IETF, for instance, and there's an assumption about how much you might trust someone just within that space. And these are all different kinds of analytics that I'll play with as we move on. Next slide, please. So I've studied mostly studied two major network operator communities. The North American Network Operators Group, NANOG, which many of you may know, the picture above, and the South Asian Network Operators Group, SANOG, down below, and I'll talk about both of them briefly in a moment. But what I very much focused upon was the role of trust relationships being formed within these communities of practice, and the importance of these trust relationships to the operation of the global internet and of BGP particularly. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a couple of quotes, just two brief quotes from interviews that I did, which should give you a flavor of what people were saying to me, but equally things that probably many of you are very familiar with. When I was asking someone about about BGP, he said, well, in the idealized world of humans not being social animals, you'd have really, really high quality, low friction functioning contacts everywhere you needed to. But the reality is that the problem with the internet is that people with whom you have no direct adjacency or any direct contractual or financial relationship can ruin your network. And this is as true, I think, for many other protocols as it is for BGP. Next slide, please. And as someone else said, well, how do you start to solve this problem? Well, there's lots of communication through back channels, lots of unofficial communication, lots of things nobody can officially talk about, but if we can all share information about it, we can make the internet a better place. There's lots of communities, and the only way that you gain admission into a community is to be a trusted individual. So very much trust within the operation of the infrastructure as much as trust in the infrastructure. Next slide, please. So when I go to a North American network operators group meeting, yes, they have the formal sessions, but much more important than the formal sessions are the hallway tracks, the informal meetings, the building of trust relationships within these spaces. And that's sufficiently important, as some of you may know, that it's not just North Americans who show up to NANOG meetings, it's people from around the world, because North America is so relatively central to the global internet. And people's affiliations to this community are in many ways as important as their affiliations to their employers. In fact, many people within the NANOG community will be hired by companies for the relationships that they hold and their ability to get things done within this community. So on the one hand, yes, the technical, commercial, political relationships that make the internet go, but on the other hand, the commitments and the trust relationships within this community that make the internet go. And that those two aren't mutually exclusive, but really very much rely upon one another. Next slide, please. But of course, this is not a purely North American problem. Like, the internet is a global system. And part of what I was interested in was, well, if I'm making the claim that trust is so important to the functioning of the global internet, how does it travel? Right? How does it get established in other geographies? And so I went to meetings of the South Asia Network Operators Group. And while South Asia as a whole is relatively peripheral to the internet compared to North America, trust was equally important in this context. Right? I frequently found people that I'd met at NANOG showing up to SANOG meetings, often as instructors. I found people within SANOG building relationships, not necessarily to their peers, yes, but much more so to others who could then facilitate those connections that were international. And so there's this way in which, sure, we now have this protocol, the Border Gateway Protocol, right, that is defined as a technology, but that very much relies upon these communities, the relationships formed within these communities, and people traveling between these communities, carrying their relationships and carrying their practices in order to build a stable system. Next slide, please. And so on the one hand, we have the technical commercial organization of the internet, right? The connection of networks that we all know. On the other hand, we've got the social organization of the internet, the overlapping network operator groups around the world. I've got a handful of them listed there. And in between, the social network of trust relationships that is neither lives in one or the other, but is really facilitated by both. People connecting networks together and come to trust each other in the practice of interconnecting networks, people negotiating best practices, building relationships within the communities of NANOG and SANOG and so on. Next slide, please. But of course, I've only talked about the problem of interpersonal trust so far, but it's equally important, I was talking about assurance structures earlier, to talk about how do we trust institutions? How do we trust an IETF, an ICANN, a regional internet registry? Now, the way that we often think about assurance structures, like a central bank or an IETF or a regional internet registry, is in terms of autonomy and independence. These are organizations that we would like to function autonomously from society. We want them to be independent. We want them to be impartial. But yet, for these institutions to function efficiently, to make sense of the world, they equally have to function in terms of what we might call embeddedness, right? Building relationships to the communities that they serve. And so, for instance, many of the people that I met at NANOG, I equally met at IETF, and I'm sure many of you in the room go to many of the network operator groups meetings that I described, or have been to some of them at least. And the balance really here is between embeddedness and autonomy, and as some scholars call it, embedded autonomy, that you want institutions that are well connected to the society that they represent, but at the same time, you want them to be functioning autonomously and independently. Now, those relationships, again, relationships of trust. So for instance, when you think about DNSSEC and the trusted community representative process, where you have people who travel to ICANN data centers to witness the signing of the DNS root keys every 6 months or so. Now, is that actually a security? Is that technically required to make DNSSEC more secure? Probably not. But it does play a significant role in ensuring the trustworthiness of the DNSSEC process, in that there are other DNS operators who I've talked to who will say, well, I don't know about ICANN, but I trust the individuals these trusted community representatives, because they witnessed this process, and I trust the individual, and therefore I have more trust in this process. Next slide, please. In the context of BGP, we see this playing out at places like ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers, and other regional internet registries, because these are the organizations that manage the resources required for BGP to operate. IP address space, autonomous system numbers. Right? And there are formal mechanisms through which this occurs. As many of you know, the ARIN Advisory Council that shepherds their policy process is populated by people elected from the community, by the community. The ARIN board is populated by people from the community, elected by the community, while at the same time, ARIN maintains a professional staff, a professional bureaucracy. So in a way to balance that embeddedness and autonomy through these mechanisms of representation, but at the same time, through established principles that are agreed upon with the community that ARIN and others may be held to account for. So for instance, notions of conservation and stewardship in the way that address space is managed. Next slide, please. Now, of course, to go back to where I began, thinking about the history of BGP, equally, there's another change afoot in BGP right now, which is instructive in thinking about the story that I've told so far. We have RPKI, which is a cryptographic mechanism for securing BGP announcements. And I'm not getting into the discussion of whether this is good or bad, but the point that I want to make from a perspective of how is control established, how does trust function, is that we're moving from a system in which interpersonal trust, community, and practice is a greater salience for maintaining the interconnection of networks, to a system in which governance and institutional accountability and assurance are more salient as the regional internet registries and other organizations start to function as trust anchors for RPKI. And it's not a complete transition, of course, but it's more a shift in emphasis in the way that BGP is managed. And it's something for us to think about critically. It gives us some clues about, well, if we're going to think about the expression of rights within the system, how do we now hold it accountable? We might earlier have said, well, we need to express these principles and rights within the practices that are being transmitted across the network operator groups, within the principles held by organizations like the IETF, the regional internet registries. And now we might have to focus much more upon, well, what are the formal mechanisms of accountability for the trust anchors to ensure that they don't violate rights, that they're not politically captured by another agency that forces them to withdraw routes, to remove certification for routes. Next slide, please. And so we go from a perspective where I started by talking about BGP as a technical problem, and I described the technology briefly. Let me now give you the brief overview of BGP as a social problem, which is what I've walked through today. Very much as circulations of trust in practice across geographies, across geographically distributed network operator groups, held together by different organizations managing standards and resources that are held accountable to these groups or not. People will debate that through mechanisms of embeddedness and autonomy as they balance. Next slide, please. Which brings us full circle back to where I began. In thinking about the balance between autonomy and accountability in rights, to talk about, well, to ask the questions of protocols, how can we exert control, how can we trust, and apply those questions to standards, resources, and topology as independent problems. And yet, next slide, please. What I'd like to suggest is that standards, resources, and topology aren't quite so independent as we might like to treat them. They're in fact intimately connected, right? And it was something, again, that came up in the conversation before I began my talk of, well, how does something in one space, how do violations of rights we see in topology affect a discussion about standards? And equally, I would suggest, how does it affect the way that resources should be managed? And that all these three are really intimately connected. And while analytically we can pull them apart, and we should pull them apart, in reality, we equally need to think about how they're connected together and how they influence each other. And one way to approach that across each of these realms, across standards, topology, and resources, is to think about how the design of technology interacts with the design of institutions required to manage that technology. So BGP needs autonomous systems, needs IP address space to be unique. And so you have regional internet registries that ensure the uniqueness of those allocations. We need to think about how they're held to account, what their policies are, but equally the relationships that these technologies assume. We had GGP, which assumed that it was a central point of control. We had EGP that assumed that, again, a central point of control and the topology. And now BGP, which assumes a completely decentralized system, but then what relationships are required to manage that, as I've argued, as I found in my research, relationships of trust cutting across these network operator groups. I'll close there. I offer this as hopefully a useful analytic for thinking about the way that we might think about control and trust in protocol design, and hopefully inform the way we think about rights and the balance of rights as articulated across those. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. We've got a couple minutes here for comments or questions, so please line up. Please remember to give your name when you start speaking. Thank you. Please, go ahead.
Ashwin, great presentation. Thank you. It's Ted Lemon, by the way. So the question that I'm running into when I think about what you just said is that we seem like we have a bit of a Hobson's choice here between a system that we currently have that doesn't actually work all that well, though it works damn well, and another system that has been proposed to replace it that would probably work well in other ways, but perhaps not so well in the ways that BGP currently works well. So I guess my question is, do you have any sense of how to navigate that, or are we just at the point of noticing that problem?
I think it's a problem that has been, at least I've seen it debated for a while, both in the network operator community as well as, I think, in the academic internet governance community. It's a hard one. I don't pretend to have a pat answer to it, because on the one hand, I think that the internet in part has been successful because it has been permissionless and people have been able to connect at will without having to get permission from anywhere and can continue to do so. On the other hand, that has come with a responsibility, thinking about that balance between autonomy and accountability. We have autonomous systems. They can configure, you can connect who you will, but accountability has largely been social. It's worked so far, but as we're seeing, increasingly there are attacks which go from the Pakistan case that you could say, oh, well, that was a local attack. It wasn't meant to spread outside, yet it did, to other more recent attacks that have been in the news again that do seem to be much more intentional. And I think the balance there is, well, we have to solve the problem in some way that the current social arrangement doesn't solve for it. And what I'm trying to point to is that really, well, then we need to start thinking much more critically about how to hold our institutions to account, because the stakes just went up in what the regional internet registries do. Yeah, I'll stop there. And I'm sorry, I don't have a pat answer to what you were saying, but I can raise the question.
Before the next one, I just want to cut the line where it is now. So, okay, thanks. Please go ahead.
Kaveh Rajberg, thank you for the presentation. I actually have multiple issues with the points there, but I will focus on the main one, which is basically the way I saw it. You mixed up different protocol stacks and different layers of stuff, which are supposed to be separate, and then draw conclusions which are, in my opinion, wrong. Because, for example, BGP is decentralized. It is supposed to be like that. And for most of the peering actually is not discussed in ARIN or SANOG or things like that. They are discussed in Global Peering Forum or European Peering Forum or venues like that. But then you make conclusions which are relevant to DNS, for example, and then you bring ICANN. You said things like people observe because they trust individuals for key signing. That's not the case. So the whole notion of trust, we cannot put all of these things in a soup and say the centralized nature of DNS versus decentralized nature of BGP versus all other protocols on top of them, and then make conclusions about trust about this big soup. We have to look at them separately, and they have separate functions. And these institutions as well, the ones you mentioned, for example, if tomorrow there is no ICANN, nothing will change in routing. Even if there is no DNS, nothing will change in routing. So we really have to look at these things separately and understand them separately, because yeah, it's really impossible to draw conclusions from top layer and then apply them to the layer below.
So I actually agree with you. They should be considered separately, and I was trying to do that. I'm sorry if that wasn't very clear to you. My focus was on BGP. I was using DNS to illustrate some of my points. I do think that the relationships of trust that I was describing are articulated differently in different protocols. I didn't dwell on DNS at any length. Now, the point that I was trying to make was that the relationships of trust, while they are articulated in different protocols differently, the communities are the same, right? So you have people who are doing DNS operations will often be involved with the network operator community, will show up to the same spaces. Those relationships of trust form that actually cut across. Now, do people trust ICANN? I'm offering you one way for thinking about how people do trust ICANN. Right? And it's not that they trust ICANN, the institution, but they trust the people witnessing the process. Now, are there other ways that you could trust ICANN? Absolutely, I don't disagree with you. Right? But I'm offering you one way through which you think about trust as being a problem of embeddedness, one way in which you think about how to hold institutions to account. Right? So on the one hand, something like an ARIN advisory council that is elected and actually is involved in the process actively. On the other hand, a trusted community representative for DNSSEC who witnesses the process and reports back on it. These are both mechanisms of trust, admittedly very different, but they're different ways through which institutions can be held to account.
Thank you. So I think we need to discuss this a bit offline as well, because just my closing point, the point of creation of an institution like ICANN was basically the community didn't want to trust in one person. So the whole thing is it's not trusting individuals, or you create a system which, based on transparency and accountability, you can trust it or you don't, but it's a system you're dealing with. It's not individuals, and the motivation and drive should never be trust in individual. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And as a closing response, I'm happy to keep talking about it. It's also important to remember that ICANN was created by the US Department of Commerce at a particular moment in history, and that there was substantial debate around who should be trusted and who should not be trusted. And I think it continues to hold true today that individuals are still trusted within these systems.
Hi, my name is Ashutosh Singh, Symantec. Nice presentations. My question is about, I feel that something was missed around the point of when we ensure trust in protocol designs, how do we cater to this disparity in, if you take legacy systems, they don't upgrade. So that point, and that is going to be the reality of the scenario. So even if you can ensure something, but you cannot always future-proof. So that's an aspect that gets, whether you take medical devices, they are $1 million, so they must be still running some Windows XP or 95 or 98. It's hard to replace them. So I feel that this discussion is missing that key element of the disparity of devices that exist out there.
Right, and I agree. I mean, for instance, thinking about BGP, just what I talked about, when you go from the way that it's designed now to the deployment of RPKI, some networks are deploying RPKI, others aren't. And it will probably be a long time before it is deployed widely in any meaningful way for multiple reasons. There are capital costs in buying new equipment. There are costs in training personnel. The new equipment has to handle cryptography. It's going to be more processor intensive. There are all these considerations that come in, which mean we're going to continue, just as we have a dual stack v4, v6 internet, we'll have a dual stack BGP that some of it has RPKI, some of it doesn't. Now, how do we start to handle that? And that's where I think the communities that I've described become really critical. On the one hand, you've got the institutions that you might start to rely upon, like the RIRs, like the IETF, like ICANN, and so on. But in those networks, those broad networks of social relationships formed within the communities of practice, the network operator groups, I think those play a critical role in allowing for some leeway in those transitions, allowing for more negotiation in those transitions at the operational level in ways that are really critical and I think overlooked in a lot of policy discussions.
Thank you for, my name is Tarat Tarakiya, I'm with OTF. Thank you, very, very thought-provoking presentation. My question is regarding the shift that you talked about with RPKI from trust to assurance. I was wondering, is there a functional difference between looking at it that way versus, for example, looking at it as a shift in between trusting communities of practice towards trusting cryptography and algorithms, and by extension, a smaller community of practice that understands how to design and build and study those systems?
Question. So I think that in this particular instance, I would say it's not so much about trusting the cryptography and the algorithm, although that's certainly an aspect of it, as it is about studying the institutions that act as the trust anchors. So if you were talking about blockchain, for instance, I would say, yes, you have you need to trust the algorithm much more in the community of practice that develops that algorithm. In this particular case, because it's public cryptography, it's well recognized, the regional internet registries are holding the root keys, not for all of it, but at least for some parts of the system. It becomes much more important to trust and hold to account the internet registries than it does the broader community of practice.
Thank you. Thank you to the people that commented in questions. Thank you, Ashwin. And I think that ends this piece, and we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda. So,
thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So this is the update on the hackathon. Who's doing that? Okay, great. Thanks. Here's the clicker. Mm-hmm. Yep. No? I think you've gone ahead too.
Thank you to Alp for making these slides. And this was presented yesterday at the hackathon, so just an update. First, we started with a discussion on the recent developments with DOH, DNS over HTTPS, DNS over TLS, and encrypted SNI, which is still a draft. And we wanted to explore them from a measurement angle and see how tools and tests which are in, let's say, measurement tests and censorship measurement tests will change. And we didn't find a web-based DNS over HTTPS test, so we made one, and this is live, so you can go to netblogs.org/tmp/DOH, I think. I can share it later, and you can basically enter one domain name and just test your responses from different publicly available DOH servers. And one thing that we might bring up with the DO community is that you will find that some of these are failing. This is because they haven't enabled the cross-origin resource sharing course header on their servers. So if they allow that without any tweaks at the client end, what you can have is like a completely distributed system for testing DOH responses. And this can also be extended to detect in DNS suppressing censorship. As DO becomes popular, I think there will be pressure from governments to DO servers like Cloudflare and Google to not to in a particular location suppress DNS responses. So this might be a useful tool to test that as well. Yeah. I think that's it. Yes, and Niels, do you want to talk about this? Please come.
Oops.
We were also laying the basis with other people there for a human rights review for DO, but then we also understood that this is a huge interconnected thing with different configurations between DOTS, DO, ESNI, opportunistic DNS, DNSSEC. So we thought before we start going into anything, let's first understand what the whole thing is, and this was the first try at that. So if you have contributions to this and try to help us understand it better by having other scenarios or even more different configurations of the combination of DNS settings, feel free to add to that. That will be extremely helpful, which will help us make reviews better. But I guess we'll get to talk to reviews later in the session as well.
Priscilla, I mean, so it's kind of a mistake to like combinatorically exploit it like this. Dot and DNS over HTTPS and DNS over Quick and DNS Crypt all have like roughly the same security properties. And No, I guess what I'm saying is like you were to write down like things that make secure channels to like to the local resolver. The issue is not the exact cryptographic technology required to make the connection.
Stop it. Yeah, go on. I mean, you jumped in the middle of the presentation, but now that you've started, please.
Oh, well, I assumed fine.
No, I think we were just at the thank you slide anyway. Please go ahead.
Okay. As I say, the issue is not the precise cryptographic technology used to make the connection to the resolver. It is the means by which you determine which resolver to use that is relevant. So you will find this much simpler if you collapse DO, DOT, DOQ, and DNS script into one giant secure channel bucket.
You mean as a method of analysis or as a recommendation?
As a method of analysis.
Because not all should have the same security properties for everything and everywhere, right?
I mean, we could talk about this offline, but like roughly, yes.
Yeah, so that's the only thing we try to find out, right? That's the only thing we try to do, this to understand what are different security properties to make that analysis. So we're not making any final decisions, we're just trying to do research. If you think that actually everything should be red or everything should be green or everything should be done in one way, please say so, and then we can base our review on that. That would be extremely helpful.
Thanks. I want to make sure that the presentation got completed, but then I want to get to the line. So do you have?
This is fine.
Oh, this is fine. So you're happy with this?
Yeah.
Cool. Please.
So I came up to ask to go back one slide, so thank you for doing that. It's impossible to see this in the back of the, no, that was the slide.
The one that's impossible to see.
Yeah. Could you describe what we're seeing here? Because it's an eye chart. I could not read anything on that slide from the back of the.
The slides are available on the data tracker.
But what are we looking at?
So we're looking on the in the column left. We're looking at different configurations of DNS, the combination of DNS over TLS, DNS over HTTPS, DNS with ESNI, and then different configurations of that combined. And then in the upper row, there's different scenarios. And then the column is filled in, what is the case where.
And if I'm reading the top correctly, green is bad in, okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I don't care whether green is bad or red is bad or.
Yeah, no, it's not standardized for what is. We're just trying to base information and then.
I think part of the problem that I've seen elsewhere, and I don't know if you've made the same mistake because I can't really pass this particularly well, and I don't think it quite matters here, is that people often conflate the notion of DNS over HTTPS and the way that it's been implemented in the only implementation that's widely deployed, where it's been coupled with the choice of resolver. And the question of who chooses the resolver and how is fundamental to all of this, and it'd be interesting to see if you could do some more exploration of that problem, as opposed to looking at channel security and the various other things, because I think we're a fairly long way down that path.
No, so we actually completely wanted to do that, but what we got on our plate was a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of different things out there. So we wanted to create some clarity, and we're not there. This was just step one in just trying to understand what different configurations possibilities are, and to understand what is actually in the network protocols, what is in the implementation, and what can we recommend and understand what happens on different levels.
Right, thanks. Hey Niels, this is Elliot. Actually, I think this is a pretty good slide as a way to start, right? And to answer Martin's point, I think Martin, I know this is an eye chart. You got to look at that. What is it? Column number 2 there, where it says network provider sets DNS provider. I think that aims towards where you were going. And to Eric, your point, what you start with is something like this, and then you figure out how to bucket. And I see some buckets forming there, and I think we all have a good feel for where those buckets are going to land. But it's nice to have this sort of comparison. So apart from the colors, I think this is a good start, and then your next step is to bucket.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Did you have, okay, so you wanted to, done. Okay. Any other comments, or are they all in? If not, then we'll move to the next section. We probably will run out of time before we get to everything on the agenda, but that's okay. We had ranges of time for the previous discussions, and we went to the maximum. So the update on the Human Rights Review Team, and that's Beatrice or Niels who's talking. Niels.
Unfortunately, Beatrice is not here. But this is just an overview of recent human rights reviews that we've done. We've done a couple again, so this is starting to become a bit more of a standing practice. This one was based on Quick. So we analyzed 3 different drafts, even though we read out a lot of other drafts. We used a bit of different methodology than with the other human rights reviews, so that we also get better in our methodology and try to understand better how to approach this. we got a lot of feedback from the community that it's better to do reviews earlier instead of last call, because at last call there's already been a lot of discussion and people don't really like to change. So we thought, let's try to do it earlier. With Quick, we might have not been so early. We heard when Gurshabat did his great review of Suit in IPWave, the feedback was, well, you've done this review really early. We would have probably caught some things ourselves. So this is like a bit of middle way down the process review. So let's see how that works. We read all the drafts and then came up and then did that next to while keeping the considerations from RFC 8280 next to it, came up with questions. We did interviews with 7 of the working group chairs, document authors, and working group contributors of about 60 to 90 minutes. We fully transcribed these interviews and then tried to puzzle together relevant answers to relevant categories from RFC 8280, and then try to clean it up and make it more readable and paraphrase. And we shared the first draft with all interviewees, incorporated the feedback, and tried to do that twice. We published it as a draft. Previously, we only have shared it as on a mailing list, but we heard from people that that was a bit hard to track. So then we put it we published it as an internet draft. We shared it on the Quick mailing list on October 22nd. And thus far, we have not received any responses on list. So I don't know whether this was because it is relatively late in the process, or the draft model was not that good. Later, I also posted the markdown version. So that's maybe something we need to configure, or maybe we should just wait a bit. But the interesting thing is that it went a kind of ballistic on Twitter, which is a bit weird for an internet draft to do that, at least when I post them. So so it's maybe different audience, different ways. But I see Lars has.
Yeah, Lars, so personally, I think you probably didn't get any comments because there didn't really seem to be anything that needed commenting. So there wasn't anything, there was nothing that was urgently needed fixing, right? Plus the working group is kind of busy with getting the protocol done at the moment. So that's sort of my personal take why you didn't get any feedback or any responses. Did you expect anything in there to raise concerns for us?
Well, there were a few considerations, but then I also got some hints of links that I should open tickets in the. I should use them to open tickets in GitHub. We could do that.
Sure.
For instance, the internationalization stuff isn't fixed yet, and I think that will be good to do it before we ship it.
Right. So again, personally, I think this is so far down the priority list of people at the moment, right, where a lot of the basic protocol stuff doesn't quite work yet or isn't interrupt tested, that I'm not surprised you didn't get any feedback on that.
No, sure, but that's where internationalization always is.
Though it sounds like you got feedback, just private feedback.
Yeah,
Right,
definitely.
right.
No, definitely.
Yeah,
So, but I'm just trying to give a state of the play, what happened, and yeah.
Mia Kudement. So I gave you some private feedback, and I think the reason why you didn't get a lot of feedback is because I think some of the issues you mentioned are not well discussed. Like some of the issues you discussed in the draft have been like heavily discussed in the working group. So many people contributed their different opinion, including people who also contribute to this group. And I don't think you reflected very well this discussion in the draft. You took a bias, or like, I don't know, you didn't reflect all the points that were discussed, so it didn't help to provide this draft in the working group because it didn't add anything to discussion. And more generally, I think the connection between issues being discussed and how those are related to actually human rights is also not well reflected. So for me, the document didn't reflect well what was done in the working group and what the issues are, and it didn't add anything to the discussion, unfortunately. So, I mean, like, I'm a little bit disappointed because I think it's a good effort and you put so much work into this, but I think the outcome didn't really value that work, to be honest. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's great. So we can do it better. But can I ask one question? So do you think that in general, the relationship between human rights and protocols is not made clear? Or you think specifically here, because we used concretely the framework from RFC 8280, and if you say that that is not clear, then that's a bigger discussion.
So I think the framework is fine. Just the text specifically doesn't really give the connection at the end. I mean, like the framework gives you a structure, which points you should discuss, right? And you do discuss this point, but you don't really reflect, you know, what is the impact at the end. You just like kind of rephrasing the discussion we already have in the working group without, as I said, adding anything from my point of view.
Okay, thanks.
So I think actually, I think the better model, which did work, is because like all these discussions happened in the quick working group, and there's like so many people and so many different opinions involved. So for me, the better model, which you're doing right now, is that people who contribute to this group also come to the quick group and actually participate in the discussion there and bring the point into discussion when the discussion happens, right? And it's not that everybody in this group has to come to every meeting and participate in every discussion, but some people do. And I think that worked very well. So I think this is a very good interconnection. I'm not sure what this additional review actually brings at the end.
Well, and it's also a risk of actually using the method of interviews, right? Because that is a way in which you repeat what has already been said, and which would actually explain why it's relevant for people outside of the working group and not so much for the people inside of the working group, because they've already been talking to each other. So that might be a direct property of this method of doing the review. So I find this extremely useful.
So I mean, also I think with the interviews, I guess you captured different opinion in the interviews, but you might still not really have captured the whole discussion, right? Because you only selected a small number of people.
Yeah, totally true. But then the problem there was we had over 100 pages of transcript, and then we put it together, and then with our notes, we still had 75 pages, and then we knew no one is going to read this, right? So then we also started weeding out, and then a lot of stuff got lost, but then we all, you know, so it's still trial and error and trying to get better.
I understand it's not easy, but I'm not.
No, but we did. So for you, this one was not useful, so we need to think about it better. That's fine. That's great.
By the way, just want to cut the line where it is now on this discussion.
Yeah, Eric Squirrela. Yeah, I read this in preparation for this meeting. I was going to send comments, and frankly, it was just seemed so disconnected from the actual work of the quick working group that it just didn't seem useful to send comments. The vast bulk of this is sort of like pressy of like what Quick does, and a lot of it's wrong, frankly, and I just didn't have the effort to correct it. But it's not useful at all to people who are engaged in Quick. And then the recommendations are sort of range between, some of them are, one of them is a specific position on like the spin bit, and then this IP header encryption stuff is just like irrelevant. And you could say like you should translate any specification. You could say you should translate. So I just don't understand it's like this just doesn't seem connected to like anything that like the working group cares about as comments. You could say any IETF specification ought to be translated. So like what's special about this one? So like you're looking at me puzzled, but I was puzzled by this. So maybe you can explain why you're looking at me puzzled.
No, so it's of course everything can be said about everything and at a larger platform, but I think especially because Quick is going to play a significantly big role, and because it also says it's because a lot of people are using it, I think the working group itself could actually work on translations and could do that. And I think there are enough resources and people in the working group to actually do that. There are working groups with a very small amount of people who maybe do not have the resources. There they could do it. Making the tooling available, the tooling is available by people in the working group, so they could also make it available. I think these are definitely things that will be possible to be done by the people in the working group.
Well, tooling already is available. These things are mostly open source. I think I rate the probability that the working group will translate Quick as somewhere between 0 and 0. So you can suggest whatever you want, but I'm looking at the editor, and I think the chance it's going to do it is nil. So I guess I'm just saying that like this is not a form of engagement that is likely to have useful impact on what working groups do. I want to echo what Miria said. The right way to do this is not to put as a long document, but to show up with the working group and like specifically engage with the working group on specific issues. And frankly, to more generally engage with the working group, people who show up and have exactly one hobby horse tend to have very little impact.
Thanks.
So Martin Thompson, I was one of the interviewees for this one, and sort of wanted to comment a bit about that process. I thought for a group like this, where we value the input and the perspective, right? So this is a perspective that we don't necessarily get a lot of in the discussions that we're having. So we value that, and we appreciate the fact that people coming into this from this perspective often don't have the depth of knowledge that the participants in the working group have, and it's kind of challenging to come up to speed. So the interviews were a kind of a good way to get that process started and sort of bootstrap your understanding of what's going on. So you read the documents, you talk to the people, maybe read the documents again. But as a process of finding problems, I think that's great. I think the end of this process is where we need to pay the attention. And you got some feedback on the specific document that was produced. If you're looking to make the contributions, I think it would be more valuable to simply say, we have identified the following things, and now we're going to go and participate in the working group on those topics. Raise the issue, discuss the issue, have some negotiation about what it is that you think you're talking about, and take it from there. And then that doesn't necessarily turn into a long-term commitment to the work. And this is one of those sort of high-energy events that we have in the IETF occasionally, where this is intense work by a single working group that you have no hope of participating in across the breadth of the issues that we're talking about. But you want to come in and you want to address a particular problem. So say the internationalization thing for the error messages was something that you cared about. You take that to the working group, you start a thread on that discussion, you participate in that aspect of the discussion. And I think people would be at least receptive to having that level of discussion without the broader thing. But at the same time, I also appreciate the fact that there's some level of validation for the things that we've done in Quick, in the design of Quick, and having someone simply say an email to the group saying, we looked at this and we appreciate that the following things have been done, and we think this is a good thing for the following reasons, would also be appreciated at some level as well, because people in the working group do understand and have these desires to make things better from the perspective of censorship and whatnot.
That was there, right?
Yeah, so you have those things in the draft, which is fine, but you can say those things in any number of ways. And what I think part of the problem here is that there's a lot of information in this document that sort of tries to cover a whole bunch of different things, and it's a little diffuse. Where if you just pick the one thing, we think that the document's fine from a censorship perspective, or pick a couple of topics, you can sort of simplify the process a little bit more, rather than having the long sections broken down in the 8280 format and whatnot. I think maybe there's a different way to provide that feedback, that's all.
Yeah, I think these are good things for looking at the guidelines document, and basically they're all really helpful for that. And we may get to that guidelines document as we go through.
Alyssa Cooper, picking up on some of what the last three people said, but something that Miria said in particular brought this to mind. So in the process of writing RFC 6973, the security area directors also tried to set up a privacy directorate, basically to do privacy-focused reviews, and it didn't go anywhere. Part of that was difficulty getting people to do the reviews, but there were some reviews that were done. And it turned out that having those kind of external reviews did very little for privacy in the IETF compared to having people in the working groups who cared about privacy designing the protections into the protocols themselves. So I think this is like, going back 6 or 7 years now, but I think nobody would say that we suffered for not having these external privacy reviews done compared to the amount of incredibly great work that has been done in furtherance of privacy in the IETF in the meantime. So that's just kind of a data point specifically with respect to privacy, that we kind of went down the same path and tried to do the same thing. And it turned out that doing the kind of engagement that Miria and Ecker and Martin just talked about, like specifically on particular issues, narrowing in the focus in individual working groups is much, much more effective than trying to like write these broad-based reviews and, come in from the outside and try to influence the work that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually an interesting data point because the last meeting we got sort of the opposite. These things are useful. So trying to find the balance between those, I think, has become sort of an issue from one time, thank you, it helped, to another time, thank you, it doesn't help. So thanks. We're almost, we're really going on time, but if you've got.
But you can drop this one. It's fine. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, since you're standing there and since guidelines is,
Yeah, so I think this is going to be extremely useful for this document, which describes how to do protocol considerations and how to do those kind of reviews. So the idea was to create a document for human rights guidelines based on RFC 8280. As many of you know, RFC 8280 is a bit of a bulky document, also because it was establishing an idea and a practice, namely the idea that there is a relationship between human rights and protocols and a practice of providing guidelines for these reviews. But by that time, we hadn't done many reviews yet. And currently, we have done many more. And therefore, we want the document to be practice-based and practice-oriented so that people ideally can do these themselves and they don't even need us to participate in the working groups or do the review. So if we are useless, that would be the perfect outcome of this document. So what we have changed in the latest version is that we tried different approaches, like using the lens of the guidelines, the lens of the perceived impact of the protocol. So Ecker said before, this is not something the working group cares about. Well, maybe there are things that the working group should care about that it doesn't care about now. So that's also a role of the review, by looking at it not from the side of the developer, but the side of the people impacted. So that might be a useful contribution. We've also documented how we've gone ahead with the expert reviews and interviews with impacted persons and or communities. So that is stuff that we have added. So possible next steps will definitely be integrating comments that we've just received in a way that could help people make different decisions about how to do a review, how to make a selection, and where to engage in the process. We could link to completed human rights reviews, but maybe then also add a bit about how they were received and do a bit of an analysis there and add useful information there. Gurshabat, sorry, I missed that, is going to be the new author editor of this document, because he's done a lot of reviews now, so it only makes sense to have him part of that. He suggested that we could reformulate the questions so that we don't have such a mess at the table as we had before, to ensure that either all good answers are yes and all bad answers are no. But then Corinne mentioned, if you do that, then you make it easier to skip over all the questions. So someone say just yes, 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 yes. So that is something that we're still trying to think about. How can we make it more consistent and easier to parse and easier to do the reviews? Outcome transparency of a protocol. You could read in that consequences for the architecture and power relationships within the infrastructure and the internet architecture. We could discuss whether that should have a separate heading, or whether that should actually go under outcome transparency, or whether we're actually muddying the waters of outcome transparency there. And then it was also mentioned that we should perhaps add environmental concerns, also because at ANRP and in recent more discussions in academic and popular literature, there has been a lot of discussion about the impact of energy consumption on climate change and the impact of climate change on the internet infrastructure and architecture. So these could also be a relevant concern. So these could things that that could be added to the guidelines. So all ideas how we can make this useful for you are extremely helpful. And if we're going the route to going towards publishing, should we then mark this as an update of RFC 8280 or not? So those are just a few questions for you.
take those to the list and just quickly, were you going to do the association draft, or we had the association draft and the political draft? Wanted to get those quickly, wanted to make sure so that we could get to the I filter, and we've now got 10 minutes left.
Oh,
So-
shit. Oh,
Yeah, no, we used up a lot of,
yeah.
we used up the maximum time on the early discussions, and
Hi, Stephen Farrell. Can I ask a question on, if you
Sure.
go back a slide?
sure, go ahead.
What the hell does that third bullet mean? I have no idea.
Sorry, what?
I have no idea what the third bullet means.
What the third point? So right now we have the thing outcome transparency, right? So is it clear what your protocol will change when it's actually implemented, right?
Okay.
So at what scale is that meant?
It's particularly the last word. I have no idea what you mean.
So it's like, so what power means, like as in current, or as in as in political power, or as an economical power, as an economic concentration, or in relation to consolidation.
Okay, so if you're suggesting that one possible next step is that these reviews try and state who in some particular IETF context has power over who else, that seems like a really bad idea.
Why?
Well, try it and then maybe find out.
Can I suggest we actually don't do political today because we don't have the time? Can we do association and then filter?
Can I do them really quickly?
Yeah, yes, you can.
One
Okay,
minute.
fine.
I can do done.
1 minute would be
They're like
great.
easy. So we've discussed association and political both a lot. What we're trying to do is in reaction to TED, I think we're trying to do two things. One thing is work on very concrete problems with the reviews, and one thing is deepen and understanding, like on a larger axis, what is the relationship. Well, I think this relationship, especially in relation to political and association draft, we discussed a lot, we worked on this a lot, and I think the discussion on the list has also petered out a bit. So I think we should either go into publication or do something else with it. So that's pretty much where we are, and that's the same with association as with political. And I think it establishes both documents a good discussion that we've had, and it further expands the relationship as put out in the charter. So hopefully that helps, and then we can continue to work on the issues as Ted said, and continue to further looking work, because these were still very basic drafts that might have taken longer than would have been needed.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I didn't have the impression reading them that they were quite ready for publication. I think there's a lot of discussion yet to be dealt with, but I'll cover that later on the list because my comments would be longer. Get Ted.
Ted Lemon, I'd really like to see some discussion of the tensions between rights, because right now every one of the rights that you talk about in these documents is stated as essentially as just a good. In other words, maximizing it would be best. And in practice, that's not really actually the case. There are often tensions between rights. And so, for example, freedom of association has some serious problems if you want to associate with me and I don't want to associate with you. And these are quite important when you're talking about human rights on the internet. So I'd really like to see that explored more. Also, I find that the documents right now are not really written in a way that would allow somebody who is not deeply interested in the topic to have any kind of reason for thinking they should read them. And so I think that one of the things that the documents might want to focus on a little bit more is sort of the sales pitch for getting somebody past the abstract and into the rest of the document without them sort of going like, you know. I mean, not that I don't mean that the documents are bad. I just mean
but I think that's true for many RFCs
because
they are specialists, and this is like a specialist. It doesn't need to be an introduction, and I think these are not meant as an introduction.
I think they might need to be more of an introduction, but we really need to have a broader conversation.
But every time it's like, let's take it back to the list, and then on the list, it doesn't happen.
There was a lot of discussion on the list that sort of, I don't see it as having ever come together.
Yeah, the discussion winds up being a denial of service attack, and it's a bit of a problem. It's difficult to have a discussion when the discussion turns into 1,000 messages and nobody's really trying to converge, but rather just trying to get their point across and be the last one to speak that point. I don't know that that's actually what's intended, but that's how it feels. So
I don't think that's the case in the discussion on these drafts.
Okay, yeah, we probably
Sorry.
could have a discussion about the discussion, and that could be entertaining. I have sort of felt as a chair that I've sort of been very laissez-faire about it, and let's see what came up. But I've never seen any of it sort of work its way to resolution and to a discussed resolution. And it's probably something we should try to do now. But I really want to cut this discussion on that one because we only have 5
Aubrey,
minutes left.
if I may just ask, would it be useful to have like an ad hoc discussion this week, Niels? Maybe just to see if maybe we can schedule something later in the week just to continue that point. You know,
We can try, that would probably be useful.
I think that's a good proposal, and I just add another one, which is that I think Aubrey and I as chairs should just work with Niels to get it to a point where we feel like it's satisfied by looking at the list, by using our knowledge, and so to work with you more on finalizing these, Niels. I think we both agree on doing that.
Okay, the other one we had was, we had a discussion, and we wanted to give it just a couple minutes, and we won't get to the open discussion on iFilter. That discussion, that document had a fair amount of unresolved discussion. And I just wanted to say in the beginning that, you know, I certainly had an impression that it was more of an engineering suggestion than it was a research group document, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk about it.
Thank you so much. Yes, next. I'm going to keep this mercifully brief. We can have arrange for a different.
You have to stay, I think you have to stay in the yellow and black.
And the clicker is here in the meeting.
Yeah, if you need it.
Here.
Just anywhere, you were just crossing out of the zone.
Okay, I'm going to try and summarize really briefly what's going on. The idea is there is a human right, which is the right to live, which many people are concerned with. And it comes about with the right of, there's a lot of tensions between freedom of speech and, as I say, the right to live. This is one of the biggest problems that we face, which is the dark side of the internet. And it may be the 0.99 or 99.9999% of the internet is wonderful, but there is a dark side. And if we can briefly turn it into the unintended consequences of not doing anything is in many, many, many different areas, and we can have a further discussion on it at a more context. Just to give you one example, which is about ISIS. 2 days ago, I was sitting with somebody in the Indian government, and he was saying to me, I wish to follow the rule of law, but as you know, India, we have a great problem with terrorism. Can you help me? So, other people have asked me also, is there a protocol solution, or is this just basically a lot of hot air? And so I will suggest to you that there are multiple protocol solutions, and also people are doing many things today. So this is not as if this does not exist, that things don't exist today, but there are non-transparent efforts to do this, and efforts by multiple governments to do various things, private companies and so forth. One possible solution is something out of SFC, which is basically a shim that sits between any protocol and any layer and any other layer, let's say possibly between the IP layer and TCP layer, and you put a metadata type in there. What is metadata? Big, good, long question. How do you decide what metadata type is for the packet? Large question. All I'm suggesting is that there are potential protocol solutions, and I will also suggest that this is probably the biggest problem that we face. And as many, many, many more millions in India come online, the people in our villages are not sophisticated. And today, when there's a fake video from someone from another sect saying a child has been kidnapped or a girl has been abused, people are killed. And this will only increase. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And one of the comments I've got, and then this will be the end of the meeting, is that the document talks about the issue in a general sense, but it also is getting into the engineering and proposing a solution. And I want to be careful about keeping the research on protocol considerations, and is there something to be considered here in terms of protocol and consideration without suggesting new protocol elements?
Absolutely.
Right.
I totally get that.
That's where the draft, for me, sort of confuses the issue and is proposing a solution to something as opposed to talking about that circle that you drew.
Absolutely. And we were
that.
trying to break it apart. We were trying to break it apart so we wouldn't, but we can certainly work on that.
Okay, thank you. We ran out of time for how we're going to move forward. I will try to take that to the list. Still have the blue things to sign for anybody that didn't sign them. And I want to thank all the people that spoke, all the presentations, and see you next time. And let's see if we can have the ad hoc conversation on some of the documents that we talked about. And if we're having it, then we'll sort of let people know so that people can join in. Thank you. The blue sheet. And there's one of the blue sheets still in the